There exists a particular and devastating historical irony, an irony that emerges when a chemical compound synthesized in a laboratory with the explicit intention of enhancing human capacity becomes instead the mechanism through which civilizations systematically poison themselves on a continental scale, creating waves of addiction and destruction that persist for generations. This is the story of methamphetamine, a substance that originated in Japanese chemistry laboratories during the 19th century, that fueled Nazi Germany's military ambitions during World War II, that was prescribed enthusiastically to American housewives and students during the post-war era, and that eventually became the foundation for one of the most severe drug crises affecting rural and urban America in the contemporary period. The narrative of methamphetamine represents a case study in how pharmaceutical innovation, institutional hubris, regulatory failure, and human desperation converge to create catastrophes that unfold across decades and that fundamentally reshape the societies within which they occur. The drug itself is not inherently different from other stimulants. It is simply amphetamine with a single additional methyl group attached to its molecular structure, a modification so seemingly minor that it might appear inconsequential. Yet this tiny chemical addition produces effects so powerful and so addictive that it has altered the trajectory of millions of lives across multiple continents and multiple centuries. The story of methamphetamine's genesis extends back to the final years of the 19th century in Japan, to a moment in the history of chemistry when scientific innovation was driven by the desire to improve upon existing compounds and to create substances with enhanced properties. In 1893, a Japanese chemist named Nagai Nagiyoshi, working in a pharmaceutical laboratory in Tokyo, conducted chemical experiments on ephedrine, a compound derived from the ephedra plant that had been used in traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years, and that possessed recognized therapeutic properties for treating respiratory ailments and various forms of fatigue. Ephedrine was a functional and relatively safe compound, a substance that produced measurable physiological effects without the dramatic dangers that characterized more potent drugs. Nagai, examining this dependable and useful substance, conceived of the idea of chemical modification, the addition of an acetyl group to ephedrine's molecular structure through a process of chemical reduction, with the intention of creating a compound that might possess enhanced therapeutic properties and increased potency. The result of Nagai's chemical innovation was methamphetamine, a new compound that represented the kind of incremental scientific progress that characterizes much of pharmaceutical development, a quiet moment of chemical innovation that occurred without fanfare or recognition of the consequences that would eventually follow. For nearly 3 decades following Nagai's synthesis of methamphetamine, the substance remained essentially a laboratory curiosity, a chemical compound that was documented in scientific literature and that was known to chemists and pharmaceutical researchers, but that had no established medical applications and no commercial production. Other chemists referenced Nagai's work in their own publications and research, acknowledging that methamphetamine had been synthesized and documenting its chemical properties, but without any clear understanding of what practical applications the substance might possess. The compound sat in the realm of theoretical chemistry, interesting from the perspective of molecular structure and chemical properties, but lacking any compelling reason for commercial development or large-scale manufacturing. It was a solution awaiting a problem, a chemical tool without a defined purpose, existing in the liminal space between scientific innovation and practical application where many chemical discoveries remain indefinitely. The situation changed in 1919 when another Japanese chemist named Akira Ogata, examining the synthesis methods that Nagai had developed and documented, conceived of improvements to the chemical process through which methamphetamine could be synthesized. Ogata streamlined the procedure, identified methods for crystallizing methamphetamine into a more stable form, and created detailed documentation of the synthesis process that was both more efficient and more accessible than Nagai's original methodology. Ogata's refinements to the synthesis represented genuine chemical innovation, creating a process that was more practical for scaled-up production, and that could be replicated more easily by chemists with varying levels of expertise. The significance of Ogata's work extended far beyond its immediate context. His detailed methodology would eventually become the foundation for how methamphetamine would be manufactured on industrial scales, first by pharmaceutical companies in Germany during the 1930s, and subsequently by clandestine chemists and criminal organizations throughout the remainder of the 20th century and into the contemporary era. Agata likely viewed his work as a straightforward contribution to chemical science, a publication that would be read by other chemists and that would advance understanding of chemical synthesis methods. What he had actually accomplished, though neither he nor the scientific community could have fully anticipated it, was the creation of a detailed instructional guide for the manufacture of one of the most destructive drugs in human history. Through the 1920s, methamphetamine remained primarily a substance of interest to chemists and pharmaceutical researchers, a compound whose properties were being studied, but for which no clear medical application had been identified. The decade was characterized by a period of scientific curiosity about methamphetamine, with various researchers conducting experiments to determine what effects the substance might produce in biological systems and what therapeutic potential it might possess. Some researchers noted that methamphetamine appeared to have stimulant properties, that it produced effects on the central nervous system that were similar to but distinct from ephedrine, and that it might have applications in treating various conditions associated with fatigue or depression. However, the absence of any commercial incentive to develop methamphetamine for medical use meant that the substance remained in the realm of academic research rather than advancing toward pharmaceutical production and distribution. The medical establishment had no pressing need for a new stimulant compound. Existing drugs and pharmaceuticals appeared adequate for treating the conditions that might potentially benefit from stimulant therapy, and there was no organized effort to commercialize methamphetamine or to conduct the kind of clinical trials that would be necessary to establish it as a legitimate medical treatment. The transformation of methamphetamine from a laboratory curiosity into a widely manufactured and distributed pharmaceutical product occurred during the 1930s in Germany, during a historical period characterized by intense focus on productivity, efficiency, and the maximization of human performance in service to state objectives. Germany in the 1930s was a society organized around principles of optimization and the elimination of human weakness, a culture in which fatigue, weakness, and limitations were viewed as impediments to progress that should be overcome through whatever means available. This cultural context proved extraordinarily receptive to a drug that promised to eliminate fatigue, to suppress the need for sleep, to enhance focus and productivity, and to provide individuals with a sense of capability and invincibility that seemed to overcome normal human limitations. Into this environment of demand for chemical enhancement and cultural receptiveness to pharmaceutical solutions to human limitations came Temmler Pharmaceuticals, a German pharmaceutical company that recognized the potential market for methamphetamine and that moved to synthesize, manufacture, and distribute the substance throughout German society. Temmler Pharmaceuticals released methamphetamine onto the German pharmaceutical market in 1938 under the brand name Pervitin, a name that was carefully selected through deliberate marketing strategy to sound friendly, innocuous, and vaguely suggestive of health and vitality, without explicitly indicating that the product was a powerful stimulant drug with significant addiction potential. The name itself, despite its cheerful connotations, concealed the profound pharmacological potency of the substance being marketed. Pervitin was presented to the German medical establishment and to the German public as a modern pharmaceutical miracle, a product of German chemical engineering and pharmaceutical innovation that represented the advancement of science in service to human capability and human productivity. The marketing campaign that accompanied Pervitin's launch was remarkably sophisticated for its era, employing visual imagery that emphasized productivity, capability, and the transcendence of human limitations through chemical means. Advertisements featured photographs of smiling workers, alert students, energetic soldiers, and capable housewives, all ostensibly made more productive and more capable through the consumption of Pervitin, all apparently transformed into optimized versions of themselves through pharmaceutical enhancement. The medical indications for which Pervitin was prescribed were extraordinarily broad and encompassed essentially any condition that might be characterized as involving fatigue, low mood, lack of motivation, or insufficient productivity. Physicians prescribed Pervitin for depression, for anxiety, for various forms of exhaustion, for what was then termed neurasthenia or nervous exhaustion, and for general dissatisfaction with life or inability to meet the demands of modern existence. The substance was presented as a solution to fatigue in any form, a pharmaceutical intervention that could restore energy and productivity to anyone experiencing the weariness that characterized modern life. The marketing materials that Temler created for Pervitin employed psychological principles designed to create desire for the product and to persuade potential consumers that they needed chemical enhancement to function adequately in society. Advertisements suggested that fatigue was not a normal and reasonable response to demanding circumstances, but rather was a sign of personal inadequacy that could and should be corrected through pharmaceutical intervention. The implication was that people who experienced fatigue without using Pervitin were failing to take advantage of modern science and were therefore unnecessarily limiting their own capabilities and productivity. The distribution strategy that Temler employed was designed to make Pervitin accessible across multiple segments of German society and through multiple commercial channels. The most straightforward form of distribution involved the sale of Pervitin tablets through pharmacies, where the substance was available to people who obtained prescriptions from physicians or who purchased it directly without prescriptions in contexts where pharmaceutical regulation permitted non-prescription sales. However, Temler's marketing strategy extended beyond simply making Pervitin available as a pharmaceutical tablet. The company also manufactured and distributed Pervitin in the form of chocolate confections, creating products such as Panzerchokolade, Tank Chocolate, and other branded chocolate products that contained methamphetamine mixed with various other ingredients. These chocolate products were marketed and sold as convenience foods, snacks that could be consumed without the stigma associated with taking pharmaceutical tablets, products that appeared to be ordinary confections but that delivered doses of methamphetamine to consumers who purchased them from general stores and confectionaries. The genius of this marketing approach was that it made methamphetamine consumption seem like a normal part of everyday life, indistinguishable from consuming regular candy or chocolate, and therefore less associated with pharmaceutical intervention or medical treatment. The marketing of methamphetamine-containing chocolate products was targeted towards specific demographic groups with advertising and product naming that highlighted the intended audience. Pilot chocolate was marketed to aviators and military personnel who might need to maintain alertness during extended flight operations. Housewife chocolate was marketed to women managing domestic labor and household responsibilities, with advertising that suggested the chocolate would help them accomplish household tasks with greater efficiency and with less fatigue. Student chocolate was marketed to people engaged in academic pursuits who needed to sustain attention and focus during extended study sessions. The specificity of this targeted marketing reflected sophisticated understanding of how different populations experience fatigue and how chemical enhancement might appeal to different groups with different motivations in different circumstances. Within a remarkably short period of time following Pervitin's market introduction, the substance became extraordinarily popular throughout German society. Pharmacies struggled to maintain adequate stock of Pervitin tablets to meet demand. Confectionaries sold through their supplies of methamphetamine-containing chocolate products almost as rapidly as they could be replenished. The consumption of Pervitin spread through German society at a scale that suggested the substance was addressing genuine demand, and that the German population found the promised benefits sufficiently compelling to adopt the use of the product enthusiastically. The medical establishment's response to Pervitin's popularity was characterized by confidence in the substance's safety and efficacy, and by the adoption of widespread prescribing practices that treated methamphetamine as a legitimate pharmaceutical intervention appropriate for addressing a broad spectrum of conditions characterized by fatigue or low mood. German physicians, operating within a cultural context that valued efficiency and productivity, and within a professional context that emphasized the application of modern pharmaceutical innovations, prescribed Pervitin with the certainty of practitioners who believed they were providing their patients with access to a genuine medical advance. The pharmaceutical literature that was published in German medical journals during the 1930s and early 1940s consistently reported positive outcomes associated with Pervitin use, and documented the substance's apparent capacity to enhance productivity, to suppress fatigue, and to improve mood and motivation. The clinical trials and observational studies that were conducted by researchers investigating Pervitin's effects generally reported results that supported the substance's use and that did not identify significant adverse effects or safety concerns. The absence of any organized recognition of addiction as a potential consequence of sustained methamphetamine use meant that physicians and researchers could observe patients requiring escalating doses or becoming distressed when access to Pervitin was restricted, and could interpret these observations as evidence that the underlying condition was becoming more severe rather than as evidence that the patients were developing addiction to the medication. The scale of Pervitin consumption in Germany by the late 1930s was extraordinary and reflected the enthusiasm with which both the medical establishment and the German population had embraced methamphetamine as a solution to fatigue and as a means of achieving the productivity that German culture demanded. Production figures suggest that Temmler Pharmaceuticals was manufacturing millions of Pervitin tablets annually, and that consumption levels across German society were so extensive that a significant portion of the adult population was using methamphetamine regularly. The integration of Pervitin into German culture was so complete by 1939 that the substance had become essentially normalized as a component of modern life, a pharmaceutical product that was as widely available and as casually consumed as aspirin or other over-the-counter medications. The German government did not intervene to restrict Pervitin distribution or to raise concerns about the substance's safety, despite the fact that some medical professionals and pharmaceutical researchers were beginning to observe health effects and behavioral changes in long-term users that were concerning, and that were difficult to explain within the existing medical frameworks for understanding Pervitin's effects. The German military's discovery of methamphetamine as a tool for enhancing soldier performance occurred during the same period that Pervitin was becoming integrated into the broader German society, and this intersection between military interest in performance enhancement and commercial pharmaceutical availability would prove to have consequences of extraordinary magnitude. The German military, organized around principles of efficiency and maximizing human capability in service to military objectives, recognized in Pervitin a substance that might provide distinct tactical and strategic advantages by enabling soldiers to operate without sleep, to maintain focus and aggression during extended combat operations, and to overcome the normal human fatigue that would typically limit military performance. Military medical authorities began conducting systematic tests and experiments investigating how methamphetamine affected military performance, documenting how the substance influenced soldiers' capacity for sustained activity, their willingness to engage in dangerous behavior, their capacity to maintain vigilance, and their subjective experience of fear and self-preservation instinct. The results of these military experiments were unambiguous. Methamphetamine appeared to produce precisely the kinds of enhancements that military strategists desired, enabling soldiers to accomplish military tasks that would be impossible for unmedicated troops, and allowing the creation of a fighting force that could operate far beyond the normal biological limitations that characterize human physiology. By 1940, methamphetamine had become essentially standard issue within the German military, distributed to soldiers with the same systematic efficiency as ammunition, uniforms, and other essential military equipment. Military Medical Corps established formal protocols for the distribution of Pervitin tablets, created documentation systems for tracking methamphetamine distribution across military units, and organized the logistics of ensuring that supply lines could provide sufficient quantities of the substance to maintain the military force's chemical enhancement. The invasion of France in the spring of 1940, the military operation known as the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, was planned and executed with the explicit understanding that German soldiers would be operating under the influence of methamphetamine, that the speed and ferocity of the assault would be partially powered by chemical enhancement rather than merely by superior strategy or military training. German tank crews pushed through the Ardennes forest in a sustained assault that required remaining awake and operational for multiple consecutive days without sleep, an achievement that violated conventional military wisdom regarding the biological requirements for adequate rest and recovery. The military objective was accomplished through a combination of superior tactical planning, advanced military technology, and the systematic administration of methamphetamine to soldiers who were required to operate without the sleep that human biology ordinarily demands. The effects of methamphetamine on soldiers' performance were documented by military observers and were characterized as extraordinarily positive from a purely tactical perspective. Soldiers who had received methamphetamine appeared to operate with greater aggression, maintained their focus on military objectives despite exhaustion, and demonstrated reduced fear responses that made them willing to engage in assaults and maneuvers that soldiers operating without chemical enhancement might refuse or would approach with greater caution. The tactical advantage that methamphetamine provided was real and was measurable in military terms. The Blitzkrieg succeeded partly because German soldiers did not require sleep in the way that conventional military doctrine assumed soldiers would require sleep, and partly because the aggression and reduced fear responses that methamphetamine produced made soldiers more willing to engage in the kinds of aggressive assaults that characterized Blitzkrieg strategy. However, what the German military command either did not recognize or chose to ignore was that the tactical advantage that methamphetamine provided in the short term would eventually be counterbalanced by serious health consequences, behavioral deterioration, and the development of addiction that would affect military unit cohesion and military effectiveness in ways that became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. The documents that have survived from the German military's methamphetamine distribution system reveal the industrial scale on which the substance was administered to soldiers. Quartermaster records show that millions of tablets were manufactured and distributed, that the logistics of the military medical system were organized around ensuring consistent supply of methamphetamine, and that the substance was treated as a legitimate military supply in the same category as food, ammunition, and fuel. Military units requested Pervitin allocations and received supplies based on their size and their expected operational requirements. Medical officers maintained records of the quantities of methamphetamine that were distributed, the units that received the supplies, and the timing of distribution relative to military operations. The systematic documentation of methamphetamine distribution reveals that the German military did not conceive of the substance as something illicit or dangerous, but rather as a legitimate pharmaceutical tool for enhancing military performance. The military's confidence in the safety and efficacy of methamphetamine meant that concerns about addiction, health effects, or long-term consequences were not considered relevant to military decision-making about whether to distribute the substance on an industrial scale. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, emerged as particularly aggressive in its use of methamphetamine, recognizing that aviation required precisely the kinds of cognitive and physiological enhancements that stimulants could provide. Pilots engaged in extended bombing missions, nighttime operations, or complex combat maneuvers required sustained attention, rapid reflexes, complex decision-making under pressure, and the capacity to maintain operational control of aircraft over extended periods. Methamphetamine appeared to enhance each of these requirements, enabling pilots to remain awake and alert during missions that would otherwise require sleep breaks that were operationally impractical. Pilot reports described the subjective experience of flying under the influence of methamphetamine as one of enhanced capability, heightened awareness, and improved performance. However, what pilots were actually experiencing was a chemically induced sense of capability and confidence that did not necessarily correspond to actual performance. The overconfidence that methamphetamine produced, combined with the impaired judgment that sustained stimulant use creates, produced situations in which pilots made tactical decisions that reflected chemical overconfidence rather than rational assessment of military circumstances. The addiction that developed among soldiers and officers who were regularly administered methamphetamine emerged gradually and was not immediately recognized as addiction in the conventional sense. Soldiers who had received methamphetamine regularly began to experience fatigue and mood deterioration when the substance was unavailable, began to request or demand continued access to methamphetamine, and displayed behavioral changes that were consistent with stimulant withdrawal. However, the military's framework for understanding these phenomena did not include the category of addiction. Instead, the symptoms were interpreted as evidence that soldiers required continued methamphetamine administration to maintain their operational capacity, that the substance had become medically necessary for soldiers to function at military standard. By 1941, some military medical officers began raising concerns about patterns they were observing in soldiers who had been regularly administered methamphetamine, documenting health problems, behavioral disturbances, and psychiatric symptoms that went beyond what would be expected from combat stress alone. These concerns were communicated through official military channels, documented in memoranda and reports, and were brought to the attention of high-ranking military medical officers. The military's response to the concerns being raised about methamphetamine's effects was characterized by acknowledgement of the problems, while maintaining the conviction that discontinuing methamphetamine distribution was not a viable option given the military's operational requirements. Military leadership recognized that the German military had become dependent on methamphetamine for maintaining the operational performance that military strategy required. Discontinuing distribution would have meant dealing with an entire military force in the process of withdrawal from methamphetamine, while simultaneously conducting military operations against multiple enemies on multiple fronts. The military's assessment was that the short-term operational benefits of continuing methamphetamine distribution outweighed the longer-term health consequences and the risks associated with creating a military force dependent on a substance that might become unavailable if supply lines were disrupted. This decision reflected institutional logic that prioritized immediate tactical advantage over long-term strategic sustainability, and it represented the beginning of the military's entrapment within a dynamic in which the performance advantages that methamphetamine provided made it extremely difficult to discontinue the substance's use without suffering immediate operational consequences. The personal pharmaceutical journey of Adolf Hitler, the supreme military leader of Nazi Germany, represented a case study in how sustained methamphetamine use, combined with various other psychoactive substances, could affect the decision-making of a person with absolute power over military strategy and political decision-making. Hitler's personal physician was Dr. Theodor Morell, a doctor whose medical credentials were genuine but whose approach to patient care appeared to reflect a philosophy of pharmaceutical intervention without adequate consideration of consequences or of whether the treatments being administered were actually beneficial. Beginning in 1936 and continuing until the final days of the Third Reich, Morell administered a complex regimen of pharmaceutical substances to Hitler through regular injections. Substances that Hitler's medical records indicate included vitamins, hormones, steroids, opioid painkillers, and methamphetamine. Morell's medical justification for these injections was that they constituted nutritional or pharmaceutical support necessary to maintain Hitler's health and energy for the enormous demands of his position, though the substances that Morell actually administered suggest that the regimen functioned less as medical treatment and more as pharmaceutical enhancement designed to maintain Hitler's energy, mood, and behavioral patterns according to Morell's assessment of what the political situation required. The medical records that Morell maintained, which were discovered following the war and which have been examined by historians and medical professionals, reveal a pattern of pharmaceutical administration that was extraordinarily concerning from the perspective of contemporary medical understanding. Hitler received injections that combined methamphetamine with opioid painkillers, particularly oxycodone, in a combination that is extraordinarily dangerous when administered regularly, and that would produce profound effects on neurological function and behavioral patterns. The frequency of these injections was substantial. Morell administered injections multiple times weekly and sometimes multiple times daily, maintaining Hitler in a state of sustained chemical alteration. The substances being administered would produce powerful effects on mood, on pain perception, on energy levels, and on judgment and decision-making capacity. The combination of stimulants and opioids would produce unpredictable effects depending on the exact doses administered and on the timing of the injections relative to each other and relative to Hitler's sleep and eating patterns. The physical manifestations of Hitler's sustained methamphetamine and opioid use became increasingly apparent in photographic and film documentation as the 1940s progressed. Hitler developed tremors, particularly noticeable in his left hand, that became visible in film footage and photographs taken during the later years of the war. His gait became increasingly unstable. His facial features appeared to deteriorate, becoming drawn and aged in ways that were not consistent with normal aging. His behavioral patterns became more erratic and increasingly volatile, with documented instances of extreme mood swings and irrational decision-making that went beyond what might be expected from the stresses of military leadership during wartime. Military officers and government officials who were in regular contact with Hitler increasingly commented in private correspondence and personal diaries about their observation that Hitler's mental acuity appeared to be declining, that his decision-making was becoming increasingly impulsive and divorced from strategic reality, and that his physical condition was deteriorating. The relationship between Hitler's methamphetamine use and the German military's strategic decisions during the final years of the war is difficult to establish with complete certainty. But the correlation between documented chemical alteration and documented military decisions that were tactically illogical is striking. Many of the strategic decisions made during 1943, 1944, and 1945 that military historians have characterized as irrational or incomprehensible appear in retrospect to have been made by a person operating under the influence of methamphetamine and opioids, a person whose judgment was impaired by sustained chemical alteration, and whose perception of military reality was distorted by stimulant-induced overconfidence and paranoia. Hitler's generals, aware that their supreme commander was chemically altered and recognizing that he was making military decisions that were strategically disastrous, found themselves in an impossible position. They could not openly confront the reality that Hitler's judgment was compromised by drug use without risking execution or severe punishment. They could only attempt to work around irrational orders and to minimize the damage caused by military strategies that were fundamentally flawed. The final months of the war, during which Hitler was confined to the Berlin bunker, and during which the German military was experiencing complete defeat on multiple fronts, were characterized by escalating methamphetamine use by Hitler and by increasingly erratic and irrational behavior. Morrell continued administering injections even as supplies became scarce, and as the military situation deteriorated beyond any possibility of German success. The concentration on chemical manipulation during a period of military collapse reveals the degree to which both Hitler and Morrell had become dependent on pharmaceutical intervention to maintain the psychological state that Hitler believed was necessary to function. When Hitler died by suicide on April 30, 1945, he left behind medical records that revealed the scope and scale of his chemical alteration, records that shocked Allied medical officers who examined them after the war, and that raised disturbing questions about the degree to which late-war German military strategy had been influenced by a supreme leader operating under the influence of dangerous pharmaceutical substances. The German military's experience with methamphetamine during World War II provided what should have been an unmistakable cautionary lesson about the dangers of systematic large-scale methamphetamine distribution. The military had demonstrated that methamphetamine could enhance short-term performance, but that sustained use inevitably produced addiction, health deterioration, behavioral problems, and ultimately military failure. The chemical enhancement that methamphetamine provided could not overcome the fundamental flaws in military strategy, the numerical superiority of opposing forces, or the basic laws of physics and biology that determine military outcomes. The use of methamphetamine had not enabled Germany to win the war. It had merely created a situation in which the military was partially dependent on a substance that could not be reliably supplied, that was producing serious health effects in soldiers and officers, and that was contributing to command decisions that made military defeat more likely rather than less likely. The conclusion of World War II in 1945 left Allied forces, particularly American forces, with captured German military documents, intact pharmaceutical supplies, and the direct testimony of German military and medical personnel regarding the extensive use of methamphetamine throughout the German military. American military medical officers examined these documents and interviewed German prisoners with considerable interest, seeking to understand how and why the German military had adopted methamphetamine use on such an extensive scale, and what the actual effects of the drug had been on military performance. The American military response to this evidence of German methamphetamine use was characterized by a particular interpretation of what had occurred, an interpretation that emphasized the German military's success in the short term in enhancing soldier performance while underestimating or downplaying the long-term health consequences, the addiction that had developed, and the degree to which methamphetamine use had ultimately contributed to military failure. Some American military medical experts concluded that the appropriate lesson from the German experience was not that methamphetamine should be abandoned, but rather that the Germans had implemented methamphetamine use incorrectly, that with better medical supervision, more careful dosing protocols, and more rigorous oversight, methamphetamine could be used effectively without producing the negative consequences that had occurred in the German military context. This interpretation reflected a particular kind of institutional confidence, the belief that American military medicine, American pharmaceutical oversight, and American scientific expertise could accomplish with methamphetamine what the Germans had failed to accomplish, that American implementation would be superior and would avoid the pitfalls that had characterized German practice. This confidence would prove to be misplaced, as American military research into methamphetamine during the late 1940s and 1950s would demonstrate many of the same patterns that had characterized German military experience: short-term performance enhancement followed by tolerance development, addiction, health deterioration, and increasing difficulty in controlling the substances use once soldiers had become dependent on it. The post-war American pharmaceutical industry's response to the evidence of methamphetamine's effects in Nazi Germany was very different from the military's cautious research orientation. American pharmaceutical companies recognized that methamphetamine had been demonstrated to have effects that millions of people might want, that the substance could be manufactured using the chemical processes that had been perfected by German chemists and by Japanese chemists, and that there existed an enormous potential market for methamphetamine in American society. The post-war American economy was characterized by prosperity, by the return of servicemen to civilian life and to the workforce, by the expansion of suburbia and suburban domestic life, and by rising expectations for productivity and consumption. Into this context of prosperity and high expectations for productivity came American pharmaceutical companies with methamphetamine-based products manufactured under various brand names including Dexedrine, Benzedrine, and later Ritalin, and other pharmaceutical methamphetamine or amphetamine products. The regulatory environment in which these products were introduced was characterized by relatively permissive FDA oversight and by limited restrictions on pharmaceutical marketing and pharmaceutical claims. The FDA, in its early years as a regulatory agency, focused primarily on issues of immediate safety, whether products appeared to kill people immediately, rather than on questions about long-term effects, addiction potential, or whether products were actually beneficial for the conditions for which they were being prescribed. Methamphetamine-based products obtained FDA approval relatively easily, with regulatory review that did not appear to scrutinize long-term effects or addiction potential with particular rigor. Once approved, these products entered the pharmaceutical marketplace with aggressive marketing campaigns directed toward physicians, toward patients, and toward various professional and consumer publications that carried pharmaceutical advertising. The marketing materials emphasized the substance's capacity to enhance productivity, to eliminate fatigue, and to enable people to accomplish more work with greater focus and energy. The American medical establishment's adoption of methamphetamine-based products as treatments for a broad spectrum of conditions followed a pattern that was strikingly similar to the German medical establishment's adoption of Pervitin during the 1930s. American physicians, operating within a medical framework that valued pharmaceutical solutions to medical problems and that lacked adequate understanding of addiction mechanisms, prescribed methamphetamine-based products with confidence for conditions ranging from depression and anxiety to obesity and simple fatigue. The substances were prescribed to housewives struggling with the exhaustion of domestic labor and childcare, to students facing academic pressure, to workers engaged in demanding occupations, and to various other populations who experienced fatigue as a component of their circumstances. The cultural context of post-war America made these prescriptions seem appropriate. The ideology of productivity, the cultural expectation that people should be able to accomplish more work, earn more money, and consume more goods, created a situation in which chemical enhancement of productivity seemed rational and desirable. The marketing of methamphetamine-based products to housewives was particularly extensive and was designed to exploit the specific psychological and physical demands that were placed on women managing households and raising children without modern conveniences that would later become standard. Advertisements featured images of smiling women, impossibly energetic and perfectly groomed, managing households with ease and grace, while looking thoroughly satisfied with their domestic roles. The implicit message was that a woman who felt exhausted or overwhelmed by household responsibilities was failing to meet the expectations of her role, and that pharmaceutical assistance could enable her to transcend her natural limitations and to become the idealized housewife that culture demanded. Physicians prescribed methamphetamine-based products to women with the confidence that they were providing medical treatment for a genuine condition, without recognizing that they were medicalizing normal human fatigue resulting from unreasonable social expectations, and without considering the long-term health effects or addiction potential of the substances they were prescribing. The weight loss market represented another major application for methamphetamine-based products in post-war America. American culture had developed aesthetic standards that demanded that women be thin while simultaneously maintaining strength and energy for household labor and childcare. Methamphetamine was extraordinarily effective at suppressing appetite, making it an ideal pharmaceutical intervention for addressing the tension between cultural demands for thinness and the normal human need for adequate nutrition. Women who desired to lose weight could visit physicians, receive prescriptions for methamphetamine-based products, and achieve weight loss through the drug's appetite-suppressing effects. The fact that methamphetamine accomplished weight loss partly through causing malnutrition and metabolic disruption was not adequately emphasized in medical discussions or in advertising. The drugs worked, women did lose weight, did appear more conform to cultural standards, did fit into smaller clothing. And this apparent success created confidence in the substances that prevented adequate questioning about whether the weight loss was actually healthy or whether the substances were appropriate long-term treatments for a condition that was as much social as medical. The period from the 1950s through the 1970s represented the apex of methamphetamine prescription in American medical practice, during which the substances were distributed through the American pharmaceutical system on a scale that was extraordinary, and that reflected the extent to which both the medical establishment and the American population had embraced the idea that methamphetamine could be an appropriate solution to the fatigue and low mood that characterized modern life. Production statistics from this period indicate that American pharmaceutical manufacturers were producing billions of methamphetamine tablets annually, tablets that were being dispensed through pharmacies across the country to patients with prescriptions from physicians, and that were being consumed by a substantial portion of the adult American population. The scale of amphetamine and methamphetamine production exceeded what would have been necessary for treating rare medical conditions. Instead, the production levels reflected the routine prescription of these substances for conditions that were common and that affected large segments of the population. The student population represented a particularly significant market for prescription methamphetamine and amphetamine products, as students engaged in competitive academic pursuits recognized that pharmaceutical stimulants could enhance their capacity to study for extended periods and to accomplish the work that their academic programs demanded. College campuses in the 1960s and 1970s were sites of intense academic pressure, with students competing for grades and academic achievement that would determine their career prospects and their place in American society. Medical students, law students, graduate students in various fields, and even undergraduate students discovered that prescription amphetamines could enable them to study for 12, 16, or 20 consecutive hours, to maintain focus on difficult material, and to accomplish academic work that would be extremely difficult without pharmaceutical assistance. The prescription of amphetamines to students was often justified on the basis that the students were experiencing academic stress, or that they were having difficulty concentrating, or that they needed help managing the demands of their educational programs. The substances circulated through college dormitories, with students sharing prescriptions or obtaining extra tablets to give to roommates or friends who needed pharmaceutical assistance with their academic work. The truck driving industry represented another substantial market for methamphetamine-based pharmaceutical products, and eventually for black market methamphetamine, as the expansion of the interstate highway system and the growth of long-distance trucking created occupational demands that appeared to necessitate chemical enhancement. Truck drivers faced pressure to maintain schedules that required driving for extraordinarily long hours without sleep, covering distances that would be physically impossible for a driver operating on normal sleep-wake cycles. Methamphetamine or pharmaceutical amphetamines enabled drivers to remain awake and to maintain the focus necessary to operate heavy trucks over extended periods. The substances were so integral to trucking industry culture that slang terms like bennies emerged to describe amphetamine pills, and the consumption of these substances became essentially normalized within the trucking industry. Truck stops became informal distribution centers where drivers could obtain amphetamines through various sources, and the availability of these substances through both pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical channels meant that truck drivers who required chemical assistance to maintain their work schedules had multiple options for obtaining the drugs they needed. The pharmaceutical industry's marketing of amphetamine and methamphetamine products maintained extraordinary confidence in these substances throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s, despite accumulating evidence that long-term use produced serious health effects and that users were developing addiction. The marketing materials consistently presented the substances as beneficial and appropriate for a broad spectrum of conditions and applications. Medical journals carried advertisements showing the results of pharmaceutical sponsorship of medical research, presenting studies that appeared to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of amphetamine products. The pharmaceutical companies provided free samples to physicians, sponsored conferences and continuing education programs, employed sales representatives who visited physician offices to promote their products, and engaged in various other strategies designed to maintain and expand physician prescribing of amphetamine and methamphetamine products. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the counterculture movement's response to amphetamine use provided a stark contrast to the medical establishment's confidence in these substances. Hippies and members of the counterculture who were generally receptive to drug experimentation and who were exploring various consciousness-altering substances recognized that methamphetamine was uniquely destructive. The slogan "Speed Kills" emerged as a warning within counterculture communities, representing a recognition that methamphetamine was different from other drugs that the counterculture was exploring. The visible deterioration of methamphetamine users, the weight loss, the dental problems, the skin damage, the behavioral deterioration, was immediately apparent even to observers without medical training. This visible destructiveness meant that even communities that were generally pro-drug experimentation and that were skeptical of mainstream medical and government authorities could recognize methamphetamine as dangerous. The counterculture's rejection of methamphetamine, despite their general receptiveness to other drugs, suggests that the dangers of methamphetamine were sufficiently apparent and sufficiently obvious that they could overcome the social pressures and cultural factors that otherwise promoted drug use. The legal status of amphetamine and methamphetamine products underwent significant change in 1970 with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, legislation that placed these substances into Schedule II of the newly created Controlled Substances Schedule, acknowledging that they had high addiction potential, but accepting that they retained medical uses that justified their continued manufacturing and prescription within a more restricted regulatory framework. The Controlled Substances Act created new restrictions on how these substances could be prescribed, what quantities could be produced, and how the substances had to be tracked and documented. The implementation of these new restrictions marked the beginning of the end of the era of casual widespread prescription of methamphetamine to the general population for conditions like obesity and fatigue. Pharmaceutical companies had to adapt their marketing strategies to comply with the new regulatory restrictions. Physicians had to maintain more careful records of prescriptions. Pharmacists had to implement new tracking procedures. However, the placement of these substances into Schedule II rather than into higher schedules of the Controlled Substances Act meant that they remained available for prescription, that pharmaceutical companies could continue to manufacture them, and that the transition from the prescription era to the criminalization era was gradual rather than abrupt. Some medical contexts continued to use these substances. They remained available for treating attention deficit disorder in children, for treating narcolepsy, for various other conditions where medical justification could be made for their prescription. However, the pharmaceutical enthusiasm for these substances that had characterized the 1950s and 1960s began to diminish, as the medical establishment was forced to confront the evidence that widespread prescription had created substantial addiction problems, and that these substances were not actually appropriate for treating the conditions like obesity and general fatigue, for which they had been prescribed so extensively. The decline of prescription methamphetamine in the 1970s and 1980s coincided with the emergence of significant black market methamphetamine production and distribution in the United States, particularly in rural areas. The knowledge of how to synthesize methamphetamine that had been developed by German chemists in the 1930s and that had been refined by Japanese chemists and by others had been documented in scientific literature and in various chemistry texts. The synthesis methods had become increasingly detailed and increasingly accessible to people with basic chemistry knowledge and access to common chemical supplies. The emergence of counterculture publications that printed detailed instructions for synthesizing methamphetamine and the broader availability of information about drug synthesis through various underground publishing ventures meant that the knowledge necessary to produce methamphetamine outside of pharmaceutical channels became increasingly accessible to anyone motivated to obtain it. The precursor chemicals necessary for methamphetamine synthesis, particularly pseudoephedrine, the active ingredient in common over-the-counter cold medicines, became a key component of illicit methamphetamine production. The chemical similarity between pseudoephedrine and methamphetamine meant that relatively straightforward chemical processes could convert common cold medications into methamphetamine. The fact that pseudoephedrine was available without prescription in pharmacies and drugstores across the country meant that the essential raw material for methamphetamine production was extraordinarily accessible. Large-scale clandestine methamphetamine production required obtaining pseudoephedrine in bulk quantities, and early clandestine producers developed strategies for obtaining these supplies through multiple pharmacy purchases or through other acquisition methods that initially avoided regulatory scrutiny. The initiation of methamphetamine production in rural America during the 1980s occurred in a specific economic and geographic context that made such production particularly appealing and particularly viable. Rural America in the 1980s was experiencing severe economic distress resulting from agricultural collapse, the decline of agricultural prices, farm bankruptcies that had decimated rural economies, and the absence of alternative economic opportunities for rural populations. Young people were leaving rural areas for cities because there was no employment available in rural communities. The populations that remained were facing poverty, unemployment, and the experience of watching their communities decline. In this context of economic desperation, methamphetamine production represented a possibility for generating income that exceeded what legitimate employment could provide in rural areas where legitimate employment opportunities were largely non-existent. Rural areas provided ideal locations for methamphetamine production from purely logistical perspectives. Properties were typically isolated, with neighbors far enough away that unusual activities or chemical odors might not be noticed. Real estate was cheap, making it affordable for people with limited resources to establish production facilities. Law enforcement presence was minimal in many rural counties, because the counties lacked the resources to employ sufficient police to adequately patrol large territories. The combination of isolation, affordable property, and limited law enforcement created conditions in which methamphetamine production could proceed with minimal risk of detection in many locations. The process of synthesizing methamphetamine from pseudoephedrine was relatively quick, taking only a few hours, and could be accomplished in a kitchen or bathroom without requiring permanent infrastructure. The profit margins for methamphetamine production were extraordinarily high. The conversion of $50 worth of cold medicine and chemicals into product worth thousands provided immediate and dramatic financial return that was extraordinarily appealing to people facing economic desperation. The environmental and health consequences of rural methamphetamine production were catastrophic. The synthesis of methamphetamine produced toxic fumes that permeated the spaces where it was produced, creating dangerous and poisonous environments for anyone in those spaces, particularly for children who often lived in homes where methamphetamine was being synthesized. The chemical process was volatile and dangerous, with explosions occurring when reactions went out of control or when mistakes were made in the synthesis process. Rural fire departments and emergency response services began reporting increasing numbers of structure fires with chemical signatures consistent with methamphetamine lab explosions, often occurring in mobile homes with occupants who suffered chemical burns and fire injuries. The chemical waste produced by methamphetamine synthesis was toxic and was often disposed of in environmentally damaging ways, dumped into streams, poured into septic systems or discarded directly onto property, creating environmental contamination that had lasting effects on soil, water, and the ecosystem. The properties where methamphetamine production occurred became contaminated with chemical residues that persisted long after the production had ended or been disrupted. The contamination often proved impossible to fully remediate, and properties became unusable for residential or other purposes. Some properties had to be condemned and demolished because the contamination was too severe to allow continued habitation. The cleanup costs for methamphetamine-contaminated properties were substantial and often fell on government entities or on property owners who had no resources to pay for remediation. The health effects of methamphetamine use itself, as opposed to exposure to the chemicals of production, became increasingly visible during the 1980s and 1990s as more people engaged in methamphetamine use. The dental destruction associated with methamphetamine use, meth mouth, became a recognized phenomenon that was visible enough to be widely discussed and widely used in drug prevention efforts. The rapid weight loss, the skin damage from compulsive scratching, the premature aging, and the behavioral changes associated with methamphetamine use created visible markers of addiction that were impossible to conceal. Users' physical deterioration happened over months rather than years, creating the appearance of accelerated aging and decline that was shocking to observers who knew people before they became methamphetamine users. The cardiovascular effects of methamphetamine were severe and resulted in heart attacks and strokes in users who were still young enough that such events would be extraordinarily unusual absent drug use. The neurological damage that methamphetamine produced was permanent in many cases, resulting in cognitive impairment that persisted even after users had discontinued drug use and the acute effects of the drug had worn off. The psychological effects included methamphetamine-induced psychosis, a condition in which users experience paranoid delusions, hallucinations, and extreme agitation that could lead to dangerous and violent behavior. The addiction that developed was profound and was characterized by extraordinary difficulty in achieving recovery, with high relapse rates that reflected both the physical properties of the drug and the psychological changes that sustained use produced in the brain. The family and community effects of methamphetamine use in rural America were as destructive as the individual health effects, and in many ways were more damaging to the broader fabric of rural communities than the individual toxicology of the drug itself. Children in homes where methamphetamine was being used by parents experienced neglect that ranged from inadequate attention and supervision to dangerous exposure to toxic chemicals and to behavioral instability from chemically altered parents. The foster care system in rural states became overwhelmed with children who had been removed from homes where parents were using methamphetamine, exceeding the capacity of the system to place children appropriately, and resulting in children being bounced between multiple foster placements, group homes, and institutional settings. The experience of childhood in a methamphetamine-affected home created trauma and instability that affected children's development, their educational achievement, and their life prospects, and that created risk factors for the children themselves, eventually using methamphetamine as adults seeking to replicate the pharmacological states with which they were familiar. The economic effects of methamphetamine use on communities were substantial and measurable. Property values in neighborhoods known to have methamphetamine problems declined dramatically as people with resources attempted to relocate away from areas associated with methamphetamine use and crime. Businesses closed because customers avoided shopping areas where they perceived risks associated with drug use and drug-related crime. Schools struggled with students who were dealing with parental methamphetamine use, who were living in unstable housing situations, who were frequently absent, who were processing trauma. The costs of law enforcement response to methamphetamine-related offenses increased significantly as police departments had to allocate resources to investigating methamphetamine labs, responding to emergencies at methamphetamine production sites, and managing the crime that emerged in communities with high methamphetamine use. The criminal justice system became the default response mechanism to methamphetamine use as treatment capacity failed to expand adequately to meet the demand. People struggling with methamphetamine addiction found themselves arrested and incarcerated rather than diverted to treatment. The costs of prosecution, incarceration, and court proceedings related to methamphetamine offenses strained county budgets and created situations in which counties were spending enormous resources on criminal justice response rather than on prevention or treatment. The incarceration of methamphetamine users created additional problems. It disrupted whatever social support systems existed for the user, exposed the user to criminal networks and criminal culture within prisons, and made reintegration into society upon release extraordinarily difficult because of the stigma and practical barriers associated with criminal conviction. By the 1990s and 2000s, Mexican drug cartels had recognized the massive market opportunity that methamphetamine represented in the United States, and had begun establishing industrial-scale methamphetamine production facilities in Mexico and elsewhere. The cartel entry into methamphetamine production transformed the market from being dominated by small-scale amateur producers to being increasingly supplied by sophisticated criminal organizations with industrial production capacity. The cartel production of methamphetamine was more efficient, more consistent, and more potent than what small-scale rural producers could achieve. The purity levels of cartel-produced methamphetamine exceeded what was typical from amateur production, meaning that users were consuming more potent substance and were therefore at greater risk of overdose and of severe addiction. The price of methamphetamine actually decreased as cartel production expanded, making the drug more accessible to more people, and expanding the market at the precise moment when the long-term effects of methamphetamine epidemics in earlier waves of use were becoming increasingly apparent. The distribution networks that cartels established were extraordinarily sophisticated, utilizing methods developed over decades of cocaine and heroin trafficking. The violence associated with cartel operations introduced new dimensions of danger and chaos to methamphetamine markets, with territorial disputes and enforcement of market control sometimes resulting in violence that affected not only drug dealers but also communities in which cartel operations were occurring or being contested. The cartel's capacity to produce methamphetamine at scales and efficiencies that far exceeded what small-scale producers could accomplish meant that the methamphetamine market became increasingly dominated by cartel product. Individual rural producers who had previously been part of the market found that they could not compete with cartel product on price or on availability, and many either exited methamphetamine production or became distributors for cartel-supplied product rather than manufacturers of their own methamphetamine. The intersection of the methamphetamine epidemic with the opioid epidemic that was simultaneously unfolding in the United States created a situation of extraordinary complexity and danger. The opioid epidemic, driven initially by pharmaceutical opioid prescription and later by heroin and fentanyl in black markets, had created millions of people addicted to opioids. Some of these opioid-dependent individuals also began using methamphetamine, either as a complement to opioid use or as an alternative when opioids were unavailable. The polydrug use pattern of combining methamphetamine with opioids created new risk profiles, with users simultaneously experiencing the cardiovascular risks of stimulant use and the respiratory depression risks of opioid use. The development of fentanyl-contaminated drug supplies meant that users of methamphetamine sometimes encountered fentanyl, which they were not expecting and for which they had no naloxone reversal agent available because they did not anticipate opioid exposure. The treatment landscape for methamphetamine addiction was substantially less developed than treatment approaches for opioid addiction, which meant that people struggling with methamphetamine dependence had fewer options for evidence-based treatment than people struggling with opioid dependence. The lack of FDA-approved medications for treating methamphetamine addiction meant that treatment relied primarily on behavioral interventions and on support programs that were not always accessible or effective for all individuals. The psychosocial effects of methamphetamine use, including the profound depression and anhedonia that characterize withdrawal, made sustained recovery extraordinarily difficult even for people who had access to treatment and who were strongly motivated to achieve recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic intersected with the methamphetamine epidemic in ways that intensified crisis conditions. Lockdowns and isolation increased the appeal of methamphetamine as an escape from pandemic-related stress. Treatment programs shut down or reduced capacity during pandemic periods. Economic disruption from pandemic-related job losses created additional economic desperation that made methamphetamine use more appealing as a coping mechanism. The overdose deaths associated with methamphetamine, particularly in the context of polydrug use involving fentanyl and other opioids, increased during pandemic years because people using drugs were often using alone without access to naloxone or to emergency services in case of overdose. The contemporary state of the methamphetamine crisis as of the 2020s represents the culmination of a century of poor decision-making, regulatory failure, and insufficient attention to addiction as a public health phenomenon requiring integrated medical, social, and economic responses. The statistics describing current methamphetamine use, methamphetamine-related hospitalizations, and methamphetamine-related overdose deaths are extraordinarily grim, documenting a situation in which methamphetamine use has reached levels that exceed the prescription era, in which the drug is more available and less expensive than at any previous point in history, and in which the purity and potency of available methamphetamine has increased substantially. The demographic characteristics of methamphetamine use have shifted over decades, from being originally concentrated among white rural populations to increasingly affecting urban populations, communities of color, and diverse demographic groups across the United States. The methods of methamphetamine use have evolved from primarily smoking and oral consumption to increasingly involving injection drug use, with all the additional health risks that injection creates, including HIV transmission, hepatitis transmission, bacterial infections, and complications related to injection technique and injection site care. The geographic distribution of the methamphetamine epidemic has expanded from rural regions, where it initially emerged, to major urban centers, with increasing reports of methamphetamine use in areas and among populations that previously had minimal methamphetamine prevalence. The relationship between methamphetamine and opioid use has created polydrug addiction patterns that complicate treatment and that increase overdose risk. The contamination of drug supplies with fentanyl creates unpredictable risks for users across multiple drug categories, including methamphetamine, because fentanyl may be present in substances where it is not expected and may not be detected by users. The treatment system's response to the methamphetamine epidemic has been insufficient and has been characterized by the same failures that have characterized treatment responses to other drug epidemics: inadequate funding, insufficient access, limited evidence-based treatment options, high costs for treatment that creates barriers for low-income populations, and geographic maldistribution that makes treatment inaccessible for rural populations. Many rural areas continue to have minimal treatment capacity, forcing people seeking treatment to travel substantial distances or to forego treatment entirely. Urban treatment systems are often overwhelmed with more demand for treatment than available capacity can accommodate, creating waiting lists and forcing people seeking treatment to make difficult choices about whether to attempt treatment despite delays or to discontinue their effort to obtain treatment. The criminal justice system continues to be the default response to methamphetamine use in many jurisdictions, with incarceration rates for methamphetamine-related offenses remaining high despite the absence of evidence that incarceration reduces drug use or drug availability. The costs of the criminal justice response to methamphetamine are substantial, consuming resources that might otherwise be devoted to prevention or treatment, and the effectiveness of incarceration in achieving public health objectives is negligible. The harm reduction approaches that have proven effective in other drug epidemics, needle exchange programs, supervised consumption sites, medication-assisted treatment, have been slow to be implemented for methamphetamine use, partly because methamphetamine has retained more negative stigma than some other drugs, partly because the lack of FDA-approved medications limits some harm reduction approaches, and partly because political opposition to harm reduction has remained stronger for methamphetamine than for opioids. The social and economic factors that make methamphetamine use appealing continue to persist in the communities most affected by the epidemic. Economic desperation, limited educational and employment opportunities, Lack of access to mental health services, prevalence of trauma, and limited access to substance abuse treatment all continue to create conditions in which methamphetamine use is an appealing response to unbearable circumstances. The failure to address these underlying conditions means that treating individual addiction without addressing the conditions that made the addiction appealing will result in continued high rates of relapse and continued high rates of initiation of new users. The pharmaceutical industry's role in creating and perpetuating the addiction crisis through aggressive marketing of prescription opioids during the 1990s and 2000s has resulted in pharmaceutical manufacturers facing significant legal liability and financial consequences for their role in the opioid epidemic. However, the lessons of the pharmaceutical industry's role in creating addiction epidemics have not been clearly applied to prevent similar patterns with other substances. The fundamental incentive structures that drove pharmaceutical companies to aggressively market opioids for off-label uses and to downplay addiction risks continue to characterize how the pharmaceutical industry operates. The regulatory mechanisms that are supposed to prevent pharmaceutical companies from marketing substances in ways that create addiction epidemics remain inadequate. The research infrastructure for understanding methamphetamine's effects on the brain and for developing evidence-based treatments remains underfunded relative to the scale of the epidemic. The absence of FDA-approved medications for treating methamphetamine addiction means that treatment relies primarily on behavioral interventions and on support programs that may have lower efficacy than might be achieved if pharmacological treatments were available. The development of such treatments would require sustained research funding and would require pharmaceutical companies to have incentives to develop treatments for methamphetamine addiction, incentives that may be weaker than the incentives to develop treatments for more profitable conditions. The policy responses to the methamphetamine epidemic have remained largely ineffective in reducing availability or in preventing new initiation into methamphetamine use. Drug enforcement efforts, while consuming enormous resources, have not substantially reduced methamphetamine availability. Border enforcement has not prevented methamphetamine imports. The regulation of precursor chemicals like pseudoephedrine has made amateur production somewhat more difficult but has not prevented it entirely. The criminalization of possession has not deterred use. The incarceration of methamphetamine users has not reduced recidivism. Each of these policy approaches has been attempted extensively, has been documented to be largely ineffective in achieving its stated objectives, yet continues to consume the vast majority of resources devoted to methamphetamine. The allocation of resources to approaches that have proven ineffective, while inadequate resources are devoted to approaches that have proven more effective, represents a fundamental failure of policymaking. The historical trajectory of methamphetamine from its synthesis in Japanese laboratories through its integration into Nazi military operations, through its prescription to American housewives, through its emergence as an urban and rural epidemic, represents one of the most comprehensively documented failures of institutional decision-making in modern history. The evidence regarding methamphetamine's dangers was clear at multiple points in this trajectory. The evidence was available to German authorities in the 1940s, when the military was beginning to recognize the addiction and health effects that soldiers were experiencing. The evidence was available to American pharmaceutical companies, and to the FDA in the 1950s and 1960s, when the medical establishment was prescribing methamphetamine to millions of people. The evidence was available to policymakers in the 1980s and 1990s, when amateur methamphetamine production was beginning to generate environmental and health crises in rural areas. At each of these points, the available evidence was sufficient to warrant substantially different policies and substantially different practices, yet the policies and practices were not substantially changed in response to the evidence. The reasons for the failure to respond to evidence regarding methamphetamine's dangers are complex and are rooted in institutional incentives, in human psychology, in the difficulty of acknowledging systematic failure, and in the political difficulty of implementing the kinds of changes that evidence suggests would be effective. Pharmaceutical companies profited from methamphetamine production and sale, creating incentives to minimize evidence of harm and to continue marketing the substances. Physicians who had prescribed methamphetamine extensively and who had built their practices around these prescriptions were reluctant to acknowledge that they had been causing harm to their patients. Law enforcement and criminal justice agencies had become institutionally invested in incarceration-based approaches to drug problems and were reluctant to acknowledge that these approaches were ineffective. Military and political leaders were reluctant to acknowledge that their decisions had been influenced by substances they did not fully understand, or that their strategies had been fundamentally flawed. The institutional difficulty of changing course, of acknowledging systematic failure, and of implementing different approaches created what can be characterized as a kind of institutional inertia in which ineffective approaches continued even as evidence of their ineffectiveness accumulated. The contemporary moment represents an opportunity to break this pattern of institutional failure, to acknowledge the accumulated evidence regarding what actually works in preventing drug addiction and in treating addiction, and to implement substantially different approaches based on what is actually known about addiction and about what reduces both drug use and the harms associated with drug use. The evidence from research, from international comparisons, from pilot programs that have been conducted in the United States suggests several clear conclusions. First, addiction is a medical condition that responds to medical treatment, not primarily a criminal matter that responds to punishment. Second, pharmaceutical treatment approaches, including medication-assisted treatment, can reduce drug use and can enable people to rebuild their lives even while maintaining therapeutic use of medications. Third, harm reduction approaches that acknowledge the reality of addiction while seeking to minimize the harm associated with addiction can reduce overdose deaths and can create conditions in which people struggling with addiction might eventually be motivated to seek recovery. Fourth, addressing the social and economic conditions that make drug use appealing, poverty, lack of employment opportunity, lack of access to education, inadequate housing, lack of access to mental health services, is necessary to actually reduce drug use rather than simply redistributing where drug use occurs. The implementation of these evidence-based approaches would require substantial changes in resource allocation, with far greater resources devoted to treatment, prevention, and harm reduction, and substantially fewer resources devoted to law enforcement and incarceration. It would require decriminalization, or at minimum substantial reduction in criminalization of drug possession and use. It would require investment in mental health services, employment opportunity, education, and housing as part of comprehensive approaches to reducing drug use. It would require acknowledging that decades of criminal justice-focused drug policy have failed to achieve their stated objectives, and that continuation of these policies is not justified. It would require political will to implement policies that face opposition from constituencies that benefit from current approaches or that hold ideological commitments to criminal justice responses regardless of evidence regarding effectiveness. The question that remains as the methamphetamine epidemic continues to claim lives, to destroy families, and to devastate communities is whether the contemporary moment will finally involve a genuine shift in policy and practice based on evidence, or whether the pattern of institutional failure will continue with slight modifications while fundamental problems remain unaddressed. The history of methamphetamine suggests that change comes slowly and that institutional interests often outweigh evidence in determining policy. However, the scale of the contemporary crisis, the number of deaths, the geographic spread of addiction, the visibility of addiction's effects, may create pressure sufficient to overcome institutional inertia and political resistance. The alternative is for the crisis to continue, for millions more people to be harmed, for communities to continue to be devastated, and for the same pattern of ineffective response to continue despite clear evidence of better alternatives. The mechanisms through which methamphetamine produces addiction, understood now through contemporary neuroscience research, reveal that the substance functions through powerful effects on the brain's dopamine system, hijacking the neural pathways that normally regulate reward, motivation, and pleasure. The dopamine system evolved through millions of years of human evolutionary history to reinforce behaviors necessary for survival: eating, reproducing, forming social bonds. By producing feelings of pleasure and motivation when these behaviors occurred. Methamphetamine essentially tricks this system, producing dopamine release in quantities and with a speed that natural behaviors cannot match, creating pleasure and motivation that are entirely chemically driven. The brain adapts to this chemical stimulation by downregulating its own dopamine production and by reducing the sensitivity of dopamine receptors, creating a state in which normal pleasures produce minimal pleasure, and in which the person requires continued methamphetamine use to feel any pleasure at all. The behavioral consequences of this neurological hijacking are profound. A person who has been using methamphetamine regularly develops the experience that nothing is enjoyable without methamphetamine, that food has no taste, that social interaction is uninteresting, that accomplishment produces no satisfaction. The only thing that produces pleasure or motivation is methamphetamine itself, creating an extraordinarily powerful incentive to continue using the substance. When a person attempts to stop using methamphetamine, the dopamine system has not yet recovered to its previous level of sensitivity and productivity, meaning that everything feels gray and unrewarding. The depression that characterizes methamphetamine withdrawal is not simply sadness. It is a profound anhedonia, an inability to feel pleasure or to feel motivated to do anything. This neurological state can persist for weeks or months, creating extraordinary psychological suffering that most people cannot endure without returning to methamphetamine use. The effects on executive function and decision-making capacity that methamphetamine produces are equally significant and equally long-lasting. Methamphetamine damages neural structures involved in executive function, in impulse control in decision-making, and in the capacity to consider long-term consequences of immediate actions. A person under the influence of methamphetamine experiences impaired judgment, increased impulsivity, and reduced capacity to consider consequences. These effects persist even after acute drug use ends, as the neural damage requires time to heal. The combination of the profound anhedonia of withdrawal and the impaired decision-making that results from methamphetamine's neurotoxic effects makes recovery extraordinarily difficult. The person experiences unbearable psychological suffering, feels incapable of experiencing pleasure from recovery, and may lack the executive function necessary to maintain sustained effort toward recovery even if they wanted to achieve it. The physical health effects of methamphetamine use extend beyond the dental, skin, and cardiovascular damage that are visibly apparent. The immune system is suppressed, making users vulnerable to infections. The gastrointestinal system is damaged, creating problems with nutrition absorption and with digestion. The respiratory system is damaged through the inhalation of methamphetamine smoke or of the toxic byproducts of clandestine methamphetamine production. The sleep system is fundamentally disrupted through sustained methamphetamine use, with users eventually becoming incapable of sleeping normally even after the drug effects have worn off, requiring extended periods of abstinence before normal sleep function returns. The social consequences of methamphetamine addiction are equally severe. Relationships are destroyed as the person's behavior becomes erratic, and as the person's commitment to obtaining and using methamphetamine supersedes all other commitments and relationships. Employment becomes impossible as the person's reliability deteriorates, and as physical and cognitive effects of use prevent normal job performance. Legal problems accumulate through property crime that methamphetamine users often commit to fund their addiction, through drug-related criminal charges, and through other consequences of the behavior that methamphetamine intoxication and methamphetamine withdrawal generate. Housing becomes unstable as the person loses employment, and as the behavioral effects of methamphetamine use create conflict with family members or roommates. Educational achievement halts as the person's cognitive function is impaired, and as time is devoted to obtaining and using methamphetamine rather than to academic pursuits. The economic costs of the methamphetamine epidemic are enormous when calculated comprehensively. The direct costs of medical care for methamphetamine-related conditions, emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and long-term treatment of the medical effects of chronic use accumulate to billions of dollars annually. The costs of criminal justice response, law enforcement, prosecution, courts, incarceration are similarly enormous. The lost productivity from people who are unable to work due to methamphetamine addiction represents an enormous economic loss. The costs of child welfare, of removing children from homes where methamphetamine is being used, of providing foster care and other alternative care, represent additional substantial economic burden. The property crime that methamphetamine users commit to fund their addiction creates costs for victims and for the criminal justice response. When these costs are aggregated, the total economic burden of the methamphetamine epidemic is staggering. Yet despite the clear documentation of these costs and effects, the responses to the epidemic continue to rely primarily on approaches that have been documented to be ineffective, and the resources devoted to effective approaches continue to be inadequate. The reasons for this disconnect between evidence and policy are partially rooted in politics, partially rooted in ideology, and partially rooted in the difficulty of acknowledging systematic failure and changing institutional practices. Politicians find it easier to advocate for law enforcement and incarceration because these approaches appear tough on crime, and because they do not require engaging with the complex social and economic issues that underlie drug addiction. Ideological commitments to criminal justice responses and to the belief that drug users simply need to exercise more willpower make it difficult to acknowledge that criminal justice responses are fundamentally ineffective. The institutional investment in law enforcement and incarceration, the agencies, the employment, the budgets, creates constituencies that benefit from continuation of these approaches even if they are ineffective at achieving public health objectives. The path forward from the contemporary methamphetamine crisis requires a fundamental shift in how American society understands addiction, how policy is formulated in response to addiction, and how resources are allocated among the various approaches to reducing drug use and its consequences. The evidence regarding what actually works in reducing drug use and in achieving recovery is clear. Comprehensive approaches that combine pharmaceutical treatment, behavioral treatment, harm reduction, and addressing the social and economic conditions that make drug use appealing are substantially more effective than criminal justice-focused approaches. Countries that have implemented such comprehensive approaches have achieved lower rates of drug use, lower rates of overdose death, and higher rates of recovery than countries that continue to rely primarily on criminal justice responses. The pharmaceutical treatment of methamphetamine addiction remains less developed than pharmaceutical treatment for opioid addiction, but research continues to identify potential medications that might help reduce methamphetamine craving and might help restore normal dopamine function more rapidly than the natural healing process allows. The development of such medications and the implementation of medication-assisted treatment for methamphetamine addiction would require investment in research and development, and would require changes in regulatory frameworks to permit the use of medications that have been demonstrated to be effective even if the mechanisms through which they work are not completely understood. The implementation of behavioral treatment approaches that have been demonstrated to be effective in research studies, but that are not widely available outside of research contexts, would require substantial increases in funding for treatment capacity and would require training of a much larger workforce of treatment professionals. The harm reduction approaches that have proven effective in reducing overdose deaths from opioids could be adapted for methamphetamine contexts, though the specific interventions would differ because methamphetamine does not have a reversal agent equivalent to naloxone for opioids. Harm reduction approaches for methamphetamine might include drug checking services that would allow users to verify the contents of what they are consuming, supervised consumption sites that would allow users to consume in environments where emergency medical care is available if needed, access to testing supplies that would detect the presence of fentanyl or other contaminants, and provision of clean equipment for those who inject methamphetamine. The implementation of such approaches in the United States would face political opposition in most jurisdictions, despite the clear evidence that such approaches reduce overdose deaths and have other public health benefits. The addressing of the social and economic conditions that make methamphetamine use appealing would require substantial investment in economic development, in educational opportunity, in employment creation, in affordable housing, and in comprehensive mental health services in the regions and communities most affected by methamphetamine use. The focus on rural communities that have been devastated by agricultural collapse and by the loss of other economic opportunities would require sustained federal and state investment in economic development and in creating the conditions in which people could build lives that did not depend on methamphetamine use. The focus on urban communities affected by methamphetamine use would require similar attention to the economic, social, and mental health conditions that contribute to drug use. The implementation of these approaches would require removing methamphetamine from Schedule II of the Controlled Substances Act in medical contexts, where it is being used for legitimate purposes, and would require decriminalizing or substantially reducing criminal penalties for methamphetamine possession for personal use. The continuation of criminalizing personal methamphetamine use creates barriers to people seeking treatment, forces people into the criminal justice system rather than the treatment system, and perpetuates the cycle of incarceration and reoffending that characterizes the criminal justice response to drug use. The removal of criminal penalties for personal use would not require decriminalizing distribution or trafficking. Trafficking could remain illegal and subject to criminal penalties, while personal possession and use would be treated as health matters rather than criminal matters. The history of methamphetamine demonstrates one of the fundamental failures of American institutional decision-making over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. The substance was synthesized in Japan for what may have been legitimate pharmaceutical purposes. It was adopted by Nazi Germany for military purposes without understanding the consequences. It was prescribed extensively by American physicians without understanding the consequences. It became a black market drug that devastated rural communities without adequate response. At each stage, the evidence regarding dangers was available, yet policy and practice failed to change in response to the evidence. The contemporary period represents another opportunity to break this pattern, to acknowledge the evidence and to implement different approaches. Whether this opportunity will be seized or whether the pattern of institutional failure will continue remains unclear. The evidence is clear about what needs to be done. The question is whether the political will exists to do it. The story of methamphetamine is ultimately a story about how human institutions fail to protect people from harm, how profit motives override health concerns, how ideology persists despite contradictory evidence, and how the most vulnerable populations bear the greatest costs of institutional failure. It is a story that should serve as a warning about the necessity of genuine precaution in the development and deployment of powerful pharmaceutical substances, about the importance of evidence-based policy, about the danger of ideological commitment to approaches that have been documented to be ineffective, and about the human and social costs of allowing institutional inertia to persist when evidence suggests different approaches would be more effective. The methamphetamine epidemic, like the opioid epidemic before it, like the cocaine epidemic before that, like the crack epidemic before that, demonstrates patterns that have been repeated throughout the history of drugs in America. Patterns of innovation followed by adoption followed by crisis followed by inadequate response followed by perpetuation of ineffective approaches. Understanding these patterns and the reasons they repeat is the necessary first step toward breaking them.